Manchuria is this piece of land located in the northeast of modern-day China. Manchuria during World War II was led by Emperor Puyi, who was the last emperor of Qing China. In this video, we'll explore what if Manchuria betrayed Japan during World War II and formed Qing China. But Manchuria wasn't always controlled by the Chinese. Russia and Japan fought a war over this territory in 1904, to which the Japanese were victorious. They didn't annex the whole territory after that. The history of the region is a bit more complicated than that. Qing China was about to collapse, and it entered a period called the Warlord era. The control of the country was divided between different military cliques, which you can think of as different countries pretty much. These military cliques were ruled by a certain warlord who had different aims for the nation. One such clique is the Fengtian clique, which could be said is the last remnant of the true Qing China. Zhang Zhulin was the last ruler of the Fengtian clique, and with the help of the Japanese, he was able to take control over the former Qing capital, Beijing. Just 1 year later, however, he was defeated by nationalist China with its ruler of Chiang Kai-shek, where he lost Beijing. The Japanese were unsatisfied with the leader of the Fengtian clique, so they assassinated him, planting bombs in his train. After that, the son of the assassinated leader took over, and he preferred to work with nationalist China instead of the Japanese. In late 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria and puppeted the territory, pretty much stealing an ally away from nationalist China. Emperor Puyi was put in charge of the new nation, and it was renamed to Manchukuo instead of the Fengtian clique. As I already mentioned, Emperor Puyi was the last emperor of Qing China, which gave him a lot of legitimacy. Manchukuo is home to the Manchu people, who have historically been the rulers of Qing China up until the many revolutions that put them down. All I'm trying to say is that the new state of Manchukuo, also just called Manchuria, were the legitimate predecessor to Qing China. In 1937, the Japanese attacked all of China, and Manchukuo supported them in their war efforts. The Japanese struggled in their war against the Chinese warlords, as they were expecting it to be easier for them. China was not unified, they were very split up actually. There was Communist China, led by Mao Zedong, and there was Nationalist China, initially led by Chiang Kai-shek. The remaining territories were led by different warlords and military cliques. Unfortunately for the Japanese, all of China that was basically in a civil war at the time decided to stop the war between themselves and unite against the Japanese threat. Japan made progress year by year and were doing good enough considering the number of soldiers that were used in the fight on both sides. Japan, however, in very late 1941, pretty much 1942, attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and brought the USA into the war. They also struck south and got involved in a war against Free France, Britain and Dutch East Indies. They also were at war with all of these countries' dominions, for example Australia, British Malaya, India, the Philippines, etc. Speaking of the Philippines, at the time they were controlled by the United States. You know that in all of my videos I usually show off some coins. This time I want to show you something different. This is a banknote from when Japan occupied the Philippines during World War II. The design is very interesting and it resembles the United States dollar. I also have a dollar from 1935 and here is the two banknotes side by side. By the way, these are my girlfriend's hands, she is helping me handle all of these banknotes. I also have a banknote from India, again from when Japan occupied them. This banknote is very similarly looking to the British pound. Now, back to the video. In the end, Japan could not survive being at war against so many powerful nations and became the first and only nation in history on which was used a nuclear bomb. Even the Soviet Union declared war against Japan. This is important for this scenario since the USSR pushed into Manchuria, which resulted in Japan surrendering. The Japanese government preferred to capitulate to the United States and Allies instead of to the Communists. After the war, the USSR was awarded all of Manchuria, which they transferred to Communist China, helping them win their civil war against the nationalist Chinese. Yes, the Chinese civil war was paused during the Japanese invasion, and after it was over, they continued fighting. The Communists did not commit too much equipment and soldiers to the war against Japan while it was ongoing. Instead, they let nationalist China to waste their manpower and resources. I'm not sure if the communists would be able to win their civil war if they don't get control over Manchuria and the support they received from the Soviet Union. After that, Manchuria became part of China and has been part of them up until today. Now, let's explore a scenario where Manchuria doesn't get destroyed by all of their neighbors, but prospers and thrives in the period between both world wars, as well as their involvement in the Second World War. As I previously mentioned, the predecessor to Manchuria, the Fengtian clique, once controlled Beijing for a bit more than a year. In this alternate timeline, I suggest that the Fengtian clique somehow gets to keep control of the old Chinese capital. This can be done with them winning a decisive battle, or perhaps they ally with one of the warlords against the nationalists, who in our timeline got control over Beijing. It doesn't matter for the outcome of this scenario how this is achieved, so I won't spend too much time explaining this. What is important is after they were defeated and Japan takes over the land. They would still get puppeted by the Japanese at the same time in our timeline, despite controlling Beijing. So, in this alternative timeline, Japan would control Beijing, which would become the capital of Manchukuo. This would make Emperor Puyi even more legitimate ruler of Qing China, as he would be part of the ruling dynasty and control the old capital. For the next couple of years before the Sino-Japanese War, Manchuria would be greatly underdeveloped by the Japanese. Many people in Manchuria would start calling for an independence of foreign occupation. In 1936, a massive protest would be held in the Tiananmen Square, where the Japanese soldiers would massacre protesting civilians. Tiananmen Square was built in 1417, believe it or not. It roughly translates to Gate of Heavenly Peace, which is very ironic considering some circumstances. It was destroyed in the 17th century when fighting between Li Zicheng's rebel forces and the forces of Manchu-led Qing dynasty damaged the building. It was redesigned and rebuilt in 1651. In the 1950s, it was just enlarged. Now, let's get back to the protest and how the Japanese dealt with it. This would anger the people, but for now, they would have to comply with the Japanese demands, as they could not rebel. This event would scar the Manchu people, who would much rather to be independent from Japan and reform Qing China. In 1937, the Sino-Japanese War would erupt and all of Japan's army would be put against the Chinese warlords. Manchuria was expected to also declare war on all of China and commit their army and war resources there. Initially, Manchuria complied with the request, but in secret they were talking with the nationalists about betraying Japan. Manchuria was building a large army in secret, and this is where most of the Japanese funding went, as well as the government budget. This is why Manchuria was so poor in this timeline. A perfect opportunity presented itself to the secret government in Manchuria, as to where they could encircle the entirety of the Japanese army and work in coordination with the nationalist Chinese. Of course, not every soldier in the front line in Manchuria knew about their plan. If some of the generals had found out about what was going on in secret, they would oppose this and choose their army to fight against the betrayers, helping Japan. Manchuria would do something very risky and declare independence from Japan. They were sponsoring rebels in Korea who would revolt in the same time as Manchuria declares their independence. For now, Manchuria would be renamed to Qing China. Most of the Manchurian and Japanese armies would be encircled in Beijing and the surrounding land they gained from the Chinese in the war. As I mentioned, Manchuria was building a secret army that was loyal to Emperor Puyi and were separate from the Manchurian army, which was controlled by the Japanese. This army would secure the encirclement and help destroy the Japanese army stationed there. The Korean uprising would ultimately fail, but it would slow down the Japanese enough so they cannot push Manchuria for the time being. Nationalist China would reach Beijing first, taking the city for themselves. This was not allowed in the secret talks between them and Manchuria, but for now, the nationalists would keep the city. Japan would completely collapse, losing their main army and all of the territory in the Asian continent. They would be left with the home islands, Taiwan and some Pacific islands. It is at this point that they sue for peace, due to pressure from within the government. In the peace deal, Manchukuo and Port Arthur would be awarded to Qing China, with the nationalists gaining Taiwan and a promise to not intervene in the war against the communists. Most likely, Japan will change their ruling party, but this is outside the scope of today's video, as it doesn't concern us in this scenario. What Japan ends up doing doesn't change the war between Manchuria and the nationalist Chinese. As I said, a war between the two countries would be declared over the city of Beijing, which both nations claim as their own. Again, it is important since it was the capital of the old Chinese Empire, and whoever controls it can say that they are the legitimate China. Communist China would be defeated sooner or later. The nationalists would prioritize defeating them, and I don't think they will stand a chance without the Soviet support and nationalist China being busy with Japan. Historically, the Fan-Tian clique had established good relations with East Turkestan, which was briefly independent in 1933, for about a year. It was absorbed into the Xinjiang province and it remained there. Xinjiang supports nationalist China in this timeline, but they decide to switch sides and support Qing China as they promise to secure their independence. Since Japan signed a peace treaty, they released Korea as an independent nation. The Korean government was heavily manipulated by Qing China, just as it has always been, and they joined on the war against the nationalist Chinese. By that point, the year would be late 1939, which means that the Second World War had started in Europe. This wouldn't affect the Chinese Civil War in any way, but it's important to mention it, since Japan will most likely stay out of the Second World War. I see them maybe trying to attack the USSR when Germany starts Operation Barbarossa, but regardless of this, the outcome would be the same. This would maybe make Germany the first nation in history to get nuked, or perhaps nukes won't be used in the Second World War. I like the second scenario where nukes are not used, since it would create for a far more alternate history scenarios in the future. Going back to China, the nationalists would start losing ground. Qing China had bought some ships from Japan, since the Japanese were in turmoil and were struggling financially. With these ships, the Qing would navally invade around the major nationalist cities, cutting off Shandong Peninsula and landing near the nationalist capital, Nanjing. Do not underestimate these gains, because they included over 50 million more people. These people would be crucial for the Qing victory, since they would support the Qing Empire. You might argue against this, saying that the Qing are Manchu people and they want to dominate the Han Chinese, just as it was done to them historically for many years. The Qing are very well aware that if they tried this, they wouldn't be successful and the Han Chinese would rebel and fight against them. This is why the Qing gets reformed, being more decentralized, allowing for autonomy within the different states that make up the empire. What the Qing will provide is diplomatic relations with other countries, trade, investment, and many more. This deal is becoming too sweet for some warlords allied with the nationalists. The leader of nationalist China, Chiang Kai-shek, would be assassinated in mid-1941, which would start a succession crisis as to who will lead the troubled nation now. The warlords are starting to betray the nationalists and start leaving one by one, joining with Qing China, offering their support. They didn't switch sides because of their kind hearts, they wanted something to gain. For some, it was just money, but for others like the Yunnan clique, it was just territory. Yunnan requested that Tibet be awarded to them and their administrative unit to grow in size, to which the Qing agreed. The Guangxi clique requested that all European occupiers are kicked away from China. This would include British Hong Kong, Portuguese Macau, and French Guangzhou Huan. The Qing would also agree to these demands if it means they topple nationalist China together. In very early 1944, the nationalists would capitulate and the Qing would now control all of China. From rags to riches, the tiny state of Manchuria managed to form Qing China. It's not all good news, however, as the Qing still had to keep their promises and take over Tibet and the European colonies in China. In Europe, Vichy France was attacked and annexed by Germany. This would leave French Indochina isolated. In this timeline, the Japanese took this massive land, which contained millions of people, in just 4 days, so it's fair to assume that the Qing would have an easy time taking the land as well. Tibet would be easily invaded, but the European colonies would be way trickier. French Guangzhou Yuan would be taken at the same time as French Indochina. Macau and Hong Kong would not give up without a fight. Since the Second World War was still ongoing and the Allies had just succeeded with Operation D-Day, they would need some more help against Germany. Qing China would offer to support the Allies in capitulating Germany, providing manpower and resources. In return, they will gain Macau and Hong Kong. The Qing would agree to these terms and together they will capitulate Germany, a bit earlier than in our timeline. The nuclear bomb won't be used in the Second World War. Also, the Allies would be the first to reach Berlin, so they would have more favorable terms against the Soviet Union. the European continent would be similarly divided as it was in our timeline. After centuries of Chinese humiliation, for now, they will be strong and united. They will even have some vassal states like Korea and Indochina. The United States maybe won't be as strong as in this scenario, due to them maybe not being involved in the Second World War, as Japan pulled them into it. In this timeline, Japan maybe won't participate in the war. The USA would be much stronger if they had bought Greenland in 1910. If you're wondering what that would look like, I have created a video on this scenario. Go check it out, and thank you for watching.